They say a single piece of cornbread can change a woman's fate. They were right. But no one could have predicted that this particular piece, baked in the dead of night by a woman no one bothered to remember, then given away before she could take a single bite, would be the only thing standing between her and a lifetime of complete invisibility. Abigail Reed, 32 years old, no family, no name worth remembering, no one who would notice if she disappeared entirely. This is the story of the woman an entire town looked through, and the one man who dared to truly look at her. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far Abigail's story travels. Now don't you dare leave, because the best part hasn't even started yet. The cornbread was nearly perfect. Abigail Reed knew it before she even pulled it from the cast iron pan. She could feel it, the slight resistance when she pressed the center with one finger, the golden crust that had formed along the edges, the faint smell of butter that had browned just enough to turn sweet rather than bitter. After 12 years of cooking in other people's kitchens, her hands had developed a kind of memory that no recipe book could teach. She set the pan on the worn wooden counter and stood back, wiping her forearms on her apron. The boarding house kitchen was already thick with the smell of boiled beans and salted pork, and through the thin wall she could hear the dining room filling up. The scrape of chair legs against pine floors, the low rumble of men talking after a long day, the occasional burst of laughter that meant someone had said something clever or crude. Abigail was not in that room. She was never in that room, not really. She moved through this boarding house the way a river moves through rock, essential, constant, and utterly taken for granted. Every morning she was awake before the sun. Every night she was the last to blow out the lamp. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended, she hauled water. She knew which ranch hands took their coffee black and which ones liked a spoon of sugar stirred in without being asked. She knew Mrs. Calloway, the boarding house owner, preferred her eggs firm and her opinions unchallenged. She knew the 2 travelling merchants in room 4 left their boots outside the door every night and expected them wiped clean by morning. She knew all of this because knowing was how she earned her place, not her room. A narrow closet behind the kitchen barely big enough for a cot and a small chest of drawers. Not her wages, a thin envelope of coins that covered almost nothing, but her place. The invisible, indispensable, unremarkable place of a woman who had learned from the time she was 7 years old that the world did not offer things to people like her. It only offered work. And if you worked hard enough, quietly enough, for long enough, maybe, you would not be turned out into the cold. That was Abigail Reed's life in the autumn of 1883, in the small frontier town of Hallow Creek, Kansas. She was cutting the cornbread into squares when she heard the front door open. New boots on the floorboards, heavy, deliberate, not the shuffle of a tired man dragging his feet after a long shift. These were the steps of someone who moved with purpose even at the end of the day. She didn't look up. It wasn't her business who came through that door. Smells like somebody actually knows what they're doing back there. The voice carried from the dining room, easy and unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need to raise itself to be heard. One of the older ranch hands chuckled in response. Mrs. Calloway said something sharp about supper being served in 10 minutes and not a minute before. Abigail set the last square of cornbread on the serving plate and told herself to stop listening. She was halfway to the door with the plate when she heard it. A small sound, almost nothing. A thin, reedy cough from somewhere near the back entrance of the kitchen. She stopped, turned. A child was standing just inside the back door, half hidden by the frame. A boy, she thought at first, though it was difficult to tell. The face was smudged with dirt, the hair cut roughly short, and the clothes were a boy's hand-me-downs several sizes too large. The child was perhaps 8 years old, perhaps younger, too thin. The kind of thin that isn't about skipping meals, but about there not being meals to skip. "Hello," Abigail said quietly, so as not to startle. The child flinched anyway. Dark eyes swept the kitchen, checking for threats, checking for exits, before settling back on her face. Then those eyes dropped to the plate in her hands. Abigail looked at the cornbread. Then she looked at the child. She thought about the dining room, where a full table of paying customers was waiting. She thought about Mrs. Calloway, who kept a precise count of every serving. She thought about her own stomach, which had not had anything since a half bowl of oatmeal at 5 that morning. She set the plate down on the counter, took one square of cornbread, her square, the one she had mentally reserved for herself after the dinner rush. The one small thing she allowed herself at the end of a 14-hour day. She wrapped it in a clean cloth and walked slowly to the back door so the child wouldn't bolt. "Here," she said, crouching down to eye level. "It's still warm." The child stared at her, then at the cloth, then grabbed it with both hands and ran. Abigail stood back up. Her knees protested. She pressed one hand to the small of her back and let out a slow breath, then picked up the plate and carried it through the swinging door into the dining room. She was not supposed to linger. Mrs. Calloway had made that clear years ago, in the particular way she made things clear, not with cruelty exactly, but with a kind of flat practicality that left no room for misunderstanding. "The guests don't need to see the cook, Abigail. It puts them off their food." She had said it without looking up from her ledger, in the same tone she might use to explain why tablecloths needed starching. Simply a fact, simply how things were. So Abigail moved quickly, setting the plate in the center of the long table, refilling water glasses without meeting anyone's eyes. She was turning to go back when she heard a chair shift. "Ma'am?" She stopped. She wasn't sure for a moment that the word had been directed at her. People rarely addressed her directly in the dining room. She was furniture, more or less, present and functional and unremarkable. She turned. The man at the end of the table was watching her, not the way men sometimes watched women in a dining room, not that sideways, dismissive flicker of assessment that immediately moved on. He was watching her the way a person watches something that has genuinely caught their attention. He was young, mid-20s probably, though the sun had aged his skin in the way it aged all frontier men, laying down lines around his eyes that had no business being there yet. He was lean but built solidly through the shoulders, the kind of build that came from actual labor rather than ambition. His hat was off, one of the few at the table who'd bothered, and his dark hair was still pressed flat from the band of it. He had an honest face, not particularly handsome in the way that made women look twice down the street, but the kind of face you kept finding yourself trusting without knowing why. His eyes were on hers, and they hadn't moved. "This your cooking?" he asked. He was holding a piece of the cornbread. He hadn't taken a bite yet. "Yes, sir," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. He took a bite. The table had mostly returned to its various conversations. Two men arguing about the price of grain, another talking about a fence line dispute. No one was paying them any attention. The man chewed slowly. Something shifted in his expression. Not performance, not the exaggerated appreciation people sometimes offered to be polite. Something quieter, genuine. "That," he said, "is the best thing I've eaten since I left my mother's table." Abigail didn't know what to say to that. Her mouth opened slightly, closed again. "Thank you," she managed. "What's in it?" he asked. "The cornbread. There's something in it I can't name." "Buttermilk," she said, "and I brown the butter before it goes in. Most people don't do that." He nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Most people don't," he agreed. Then after a pause, "Colton Mercer." He didn't offer his hand. She was holding a water pitcher, but he said his name like an introduction, not an announcement. "Abigail Reed," she said. He nodded once more. "Good to meet you, Abigail Reed." She carried the empty pitcher back to the kitchen. Behind the swinging door, she stood very still for a moment and tried to identify what she was feeling. It was strange. That was all she could settle on. It had felt strange. Normal men in that dining room did not learn her name. She told herself it meant nothing. She had been told that kind of thing before. Not often, but once or twice. And it had always meant nothing. She went back to washing dishes. The kitchen closed around her like it always did. Familiar, safe, invisible. Outside in the dining room, she heard Colton Mercer laugh at something someone said. It was a good laugh. Uncomplicated. She told herself to stop listening. She did not sleep particularly well that night. This she blamed on the cold. An early autumn chill had crept under the gap at the bottom of her door, and her single wool blanket was beginning to show its age. She did not blame it on the brief conversation in the dining room, because doing so would have been foolish, and Abigail had trained herself over many years to be rigorously practical about such things. She lay on her cot and looked at the ceiling and thought, as she often did in the late hours, about the orphanage. She had spent the first 16 years of her life at Hartwell House, a grim grey building on the eastern edge of a small Missouri town that prided itself on Christian charity and delivered something considerably less. It was not, she would sometimes reflect in her clearer moments, a place of deliberate cruelty. Mrs. Hartwell herself was not a cruel woman, but she was efficient in the way that institutions tend to make people efficient, measuring worth in terms of usefulness and sorting children accordingly. The pretty ones moved through quickly. The small ones with delicate features and bright expressions and hair that curled just right, those ones got adopted, sometimes within months of arrival. Couples would come on visiting days, and you could see them scanning the room the way people scanned a market stall, looking for the thing that caught the light. Abigail never caught the light. She was large-boned from early childhood, growing faster and broader than the other girls in a way that made the donated dresses never quite fit right. Her face was pleasant enough, this she had heard said, once, by a woman who had subsequently chosen a smaller girl, but pleasant was not remarkable. And in the economy of the orphanage, remarkable was what moved you forward. So Abigail stayed, and she learned to cook. It had started as assignment, kitchen duty, because she was strong enough to carry heavy pots and responsible enough not to burn things. But over the years it became something else. In the kitchen she was competent. In the kitchen she was needed. In the kitchen the measure of her worth was clear and immediate. Did the food taste good? Did people eat it? Did they come back for more? And the answers, year after year, were yes. She had left Hartwell House at 16 with a small bundle of clothes, a few recipes she'd committed to memory, and a firm and practical understanding of her place in the world. She was useful. She was not chosen. Those were simply different categories of person, and she had long since made peace with being in the second one. Or so she told herself, lying on her cot in the cold, listening to the wind move through the eaves of the boarding house. She did not think about Colton Mercer's expression when he said, "Good to meet you, Abigail Reed." She did not think about the way he had said her full name, unhurried, like it was worth taking the time to say properly. She closed her eyes. She slept. He was there the next morning. This surprised her. Most of the guests who arrived in the evening were travelers, merchants, drifters, men passing through on their way to somewhere else. They ate supper, slept, ate breakfast, and were gone before the sun was fully up. Colton Mercer was at the breakfast table when she came in with the coffee, sitting in the same chair as the night before, looking at nothing in particular through the window that faced the street. "Morning," he said when she poured his cup. He said it like they had established something the night before that carried forward naturally. "Morning," she replied, and moved on to the next cup. She could feel him watching her as she moved around the table, not in a way that made her skin crawl. She knew that feeling, had encountered it often enough to recognize it immediately. This was different. This was the feeling of someone paying attention, which was its own peculiar and unsettling sensation because she was so thoroughly unaccustomed to it. She brought out the biscuits. She brought out the gravy. She refilled the cups. She did not linger. But as she was returning to the kitchen, she heard him speak behind her, not to her, but to the man beside him, an older fellow who worked at the grain mill. "That woman," Colton said, his voice low, conversational. "Abigail. How long has she been here?" The mill worker glanced toward the kitchen door. "Abigail? Oh, years. Since before I started coming here regular. Keeps to herself mostly. Good cook." A pause. "Why?" "Just noticed something," Colton said. The door swung shut behind her. In the kitchen, Abigail set down the biscuit pan and stood very still for a moment, her hands flat on the counter. Just noticed something. She told herself, firmly and precisely, that this was nothing. Men said all manner of things at breakfast tables. It was meaningless. He was passing through, same as everyone else, and by tomorrow morning he would be gone. And she would be exactly where she had always been, behind this door, in this kitchen, making breakfast for the next set of strangers. She picked up a dishcloth and began wiping down the counter with careful, methodical strokes. Outside, she heard the millworker laugh at something Colton had said. She told herself to stop listening. She did not stop. He stayed 3 more days. In that time, Abigail learned the following things about Colton Mercer. Not because she sought them out, but because a boarding house kitchen is separated from its dining room by a single swinging door and thin walls. He owned a ranch 6 miles east of Hallow Creek. Not a large spread, not yet, but growing. He had inherited it from his father 2 years prior, at the age of 24, and had spent those 2 years working it harder than anyone expected a young man to work something he'd been given rather than earned. He had come to town for supplies and to settle an account at the feed store. He had, apparently, no wife. This last fact was conveyed when Mrs. Calloway, who was nothing if not direct, asked him about it over supper on his second night. "Not yet," he had said, and left it at that. Mrs. Calloway had glanced toward the kitchen with an expression that Abigail, who had seen it through the door's small window, could not quite read. She did not examine it further. On his second afternoon, she came out the back door of the kitchen with a bucket of slop for the chickens and found Colton Mercer leaning against the fence, watching the street. He turned when he heard her and didn't look away when he realized who it was. "You're always working," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even particularly a question. It sounded more like an observation about weather, something noted simply because it was there. "Work doesn't stop," she said, and moved past him toward the chicken pen. He fell into step beside her to her surprise, and held the gate when she reached it. She looked at him sideways. "You don't have to—" she started. "I know," he said pleasantly. She distributed the slop. He stood at the fence and watched the chickens argue over it. "Where are you from, originally?" he asked. "Missouri." A pause. "An orphanage?" She wasn't sure why she said it that way. Most people, when they asked, got the short answer, Missouri, period, full stop. But something in the directness of his question had pulled the longer one out of her before she'd considered it. He absorbed this without any of the various reactions she had learned to anticipate. The uncomfortable oversympathy, the polite pivot to another subject, the slight stiffening that signaled I did not need to know that much. He simply nodded. "Hard start," he said. "I managed," she said. "I can see that." He looked at her then, directly, the same way he had in the dining room on the first night. "You built something here." She almost laughed. Not bitterly. She wasn't a bitter woman, had fought that tendency in herself with steady deliberateness over the years, but something incredulous moved through her. "I cook in someone else's kitchen," she said. "I sleep in a closet. I don't think that constitutes building something." "You fed a child last night," he said. She went still. He had seen. She thought about that, tried to calculate the angles, figure out how he could have seen, and then realized it didn't matter, because his expression held no judgment, no smugness at having caught her, only something quiet and steady that she didn't have a name for yet. "It was just a piece of cornbread," she said finally. "You gave away your own supper." "It was just cornbread," she repeated, and her voice came out more firmly than she intended. He was quiet for a moment. The chickens had finished and were dispersing in the aimless, satisfied way of chickens. "You don't take compliments easily," he said. "I don't get them often enough to practice." He smiled at that. It was a real smile, arrived at, not deployed. "No," he said. "I imagine not." She didn't know what to do with that, so she picked up the empty bucket and said she needed to start the supper preparations. He stepped back from the gate to let her pass. She was several steps away when he spoke again. "I'm headed back to the ranch Saturday morning," he said. "Safe travels," she replied without turning around. A pause. "The Harvest Festival is in 3 weeks, he said. She stopped walking. Her back was still to him. "I know," she said. "Maybe I'll see you there." She did not respond to that. She walked back into the kitchen and set down the bucket and stood at the counter for a moment with her eyes closed, breathing steadily. The Harvest Festival. She had attended it every year for the past 8 years. Not to dance, not to socialize, to help with the food, to carry trays and keep the long serving tables stocked, and smile agreeably when people took food without acknowledging who had made it. "Maybe I'll see you there." She pressed her palms flat on the counter. She told herself not to read anything into it. She told herself that with considerably less conviction than usual. The 3 weeks between Colton Mercer's departure and the Harvest Festival passed the way most stretches of time passed for Abigail, in a steady procession of tasks, each one following the next with the comfortable predictability of something deeply rehearsed. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended a tear in Mrs. Calloway's tablecloth, she discovered the back flue on the stove needed clearing, and cleared it herself rather than waiting for the handyman who consistently forgot. She baked, she fed people, she went to bed, she woke up, she did it again. She did not think about Colton Mercer. She thought about Colton Mercer roughly every 3rd hour. She had a system for this, which she had developed over the years for the occasional moment when something or someone punctured the careful insulation of her daily routine. The system was simple. When the thought arose, she located a task and concentrated on it with great intensity until the thought passed. This worked most of the time. It was particularly effective during cooking, when her hands and her senses were fully occupied, and her mind had to focus or something would burn. Where it failed was in the quiet. Late at night, after the kitchen was clean and the lamps were low, and she was lying on her cot with nothing requiring her attention, the thought of him would arrive with an ease that made her uncomfortable. Not the grand, sweeping thought of romance. She had trained herself away from that kind of dangerous imagining years ago, but smaller things. The way he'd held the gate. The directness of his questions. The fact that he'd said you built something here like he meant it. Like he had looked at her life and found in it something to respect. No one had ever looked at her life and found something to respect. She was useful. She was appreciated in the way a good stove is appreciated, reliably, functionally, without sentiment. Colton Mercer had looked at her and seemed to see a person. A particular person with specific qualities worth noticing. She didn't trust it entirely. Trust was not something she extended easily or without evidence, but she also could not dismiss it entirely, which was perhaps more unsettling. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and told herself to be sensible. Sensible, for Abigail Reed, had always been the safest country. She was not sure, for the first time in a very long time, that she wanted to stay there. The night before the Harvest Festival, she baked. She didn't have to. The food for the festival was being organized by the church auxiliary, and her contribution had already been arranged. 3 pans of her cornbread promised to Mrs. Eliza Dawson, who headed the auxiliary with the focused energy of a woman who had found her calling and intended to exercise it fully. But Abigail baked anyway. After the boarding house kitchen was cleaned and the last guests had retired, she moved quietly in the lamplight, and she made things with her hands, because making things with her hands was the only prayer she had ever known. She made apple butter from the last of the summer apples. She made a small pie from dried peaches with a lattice crust that she spent longer on than was strictly necessary, pressing each strip down carefully. She made a batch of molasses cookies that filled the kitchen with a warm, spiced smell she associated with nothing in particular and everything in general, with the idea of autumn, with the idea of something being enough. She put most of it away for the festival. She kept 1 cookie for herself. She ate it standing at the counter in the lamplight, in her nightgown and her apron, with flour on her hands. It was good. It was very good. She allowed herself a moment of straightforward satisfaction, which she granted herself more easily around food than around any other area of her life. Then she washed her hands, turned down the lamp, and went to bed. Tomorrow, she told herself, was just another day. She almost believed it. The morning of the Harvest Festival arrived the way most important mornings do, quietly, without announcement, looking no different from any other day until you were already inside it. Abigail was up at 4:30, same as always. The kitchen was cold when she lit the stove, and she worked in the blue-grey dark before the lamp caught, her hands moving through the familiar motions of fire starting, the way a blind woman might, by memory alone, by the particular weight and texture of each small task. She had the water on and the first batch of biscuits in the oven before the sky outside the small kitchen window had shifted from black to the deep purple that came just before dawn. She did not think about the festival. She thought about biscuits. This was strategy, not accident. By the time Mrs. Calloway appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6, wrapped in her wool housecoat and wearing the expression of a woman constitutionally opposed to mornings, Abigail had already completed what most people would consider a full morning's work. The 3 promised pans of cornbread were wrapped in clean cloth, stacked near the back door. The boarding house breakfast was underway. The kitchen smelled of coffee and rendered bacon fat and something sweet underneath. The apple butter she'd jarred the night before, still faintly warm on the shelf. Mrs. Calloway surveyed all of this with the particular expression she reserved for things she approved of, but would not say so. "The auxiliary pickup is at 8, she said instead. "I know," said Abigail. "And you'll be done here by noon?" "By 11, Abigail said. "Probably earlier." Mrs. Calloway made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal, and went to pour her coffee. After a moment, she said without turning around, "You should wear the blue dress today, the one with the buttons." Abigail looked at her. Mrs. Calloway took a long sip of her coffee and looked out the window. "It suits you," she added, in the tone of someone leaving a room even when they're still standing in it. Abigail said nothing. She turned back to the stove and tended to the bacon and tried to identify what she felt. Not quite warmth. Something more careful than that. Mrs. Calloway was not a demonstrative woman, and her version of kindness came out sideways, half hidden inside practical statements like finding a coin tucked into the fold of a handkerchief. You had to know to look for it. The blue dress. Abigail had owned it for 2 years without wearing it anywhere but church. It had been a gift, second-hand, from the wife of a merchant who had passed through the previous winter and left it behind by accident or intention. She'd never been sure. It fit her, which was its own small miracle, because most clothes did not fit her the way clothes were supposed to fit. The fabric was good, heavier cotton, deep blue, the buttons real bone. She had washed and pressed it twice without ever putting it on for anything that mattered. She finished the breakfast service, she cleaned the kitchen, she went to her room and put on the blue dress. She stood in front of the small mirror above her washstand and looked at herself for a moment, not with the critical inventory she usually performed, cataloguing the round of her shoulders, the fullness of her jaw, the places where the dress pulled and where it lay flat, but simply looked, just looked, the way you look at something when you're trying to see it plain. She looked fine. She looked like herself, which was both less and more than she usually allowed herself to acknowledge. She pinned her hair up, put on her coat, picked up the wrapped cornbread, and walked out the door. The day was bright and cold and smelled like wood smoke and fallen leaves. She told herself she was not looking for anyone. The festival grounds were set up in the wide open lot beside the grain mill, which was the largest flat space in Hallow Creek, and therefore the site of every outdoor gathering the town staged, from summer barn dances to the annual cattle auction to this, the Harvest Festival, which was the event the town seemed most collectively willing to put effort into. Strings of lanterns had been hung between wooden posts driven into the ground the day before. Long tables ran the length of the serving area, covered in white cloth that the wind kept trying to lift at the corners. A small platform at the far end held 3 musicians, fiddle, banjo, and a battered upright bass, who were still tuning when Abigail arrived, and hadn't quite settled into agreement with each other yet. She found Mrs. Eliza Dawson at the serving table, directing traffic with the confidence of a general who had fought this particular battle before and intended to win it again. "Abigail," Mrs. Dawson received the cornbread with the efficiency of someone who had been expecting it. "Perfect. Put it on the end there. We'll uncover it when we open at noon." A pause, during which her eyes did a swift, involuntary sweep of Abigail's dress. Something shifted in her expression, not unpleasant, simply surprised. "You look well today." "Thank you," Abigail said. She found her place behind the table and settled in. This was familiar territory. This she knew. The measuring and portioning, the keeping track of what needed refilling, the logistics of feeding a large number of people efficiently and without chaos. She was good at this, and the goodness of being good at something settled over her like a comfortable coat. For the next 2 hours, she worked steadily and without excess thought, and the morning passed the way good working mornings pass, not quickly exactly, but smoothly, one task dissolving naturally into the next. The crowd built gradually. Families arrived from outlying farms, the children running ahead and the parents following with the slightly dazed look of people who had temporarily escaped their ordinary obligations. Young women came in groups of 2 and 3, wearing their best dresses, scanning the grounds with the bright, purposeful eyes of people who had specific hopes for the afternoon. The older men gathered near the far fence to discuss things of great importance in low voices. The fiddle and banjo found their agreement somewhere around 11, and the music started properly, and the open space in front of the platform filled slowly with people who had been waiting for permission to stop standing still. Abigail served cornbread. She refilled the bean crocks. She accepted thanks when they were offered, and did not require them when they weren't. She was not looking for anyone. She became aware of him the way you become aware of weather. Not seeing it directly at first, but sensing the shift in atmosphere that precedes it, a change in the quality of the air around a particular part of the crowd. She looked up from the serving table and found him perhaps 30 feet away, talking with 2 other men near the fence line, his hat in his hand and his eyes on the conversation in front of him. He looked different outdoors, or maybe she had only seen him indoors, in the close quarters of the boarding house, where everything was compressed and slightly dim. Out here, in the flat autumn light, he seemed more fully himself, at ease in his body, at ease in the space, the kind of person who fit the landscape they inhabited rather than merely enduring it. As if feeling the weight of her attention, he glanced over. Their eyes met across the crowd. He raised a hand, so not a wave exactly, something smaller and more direct. An acknowledgement, "I see you." She nodded back, the way you nod when you are pretending the gesture costs you nothing, and returned her attention to the serving table. Her heart was beating in a way she found highly inconvenient. The afternoon deepened, the music grew more confident, and the dancers multiplied, and the smell of food and wood smoke and cold air mixed together into something that was, Abigail had to admit, lovely. The festival had that quality she associated with the better moments of communal life. The specific pleasure of people being temporarily kind to each other, temporarily willing to set aside the frictions and resentments of daily life in favor of something shared. She watched it all from behind the serving table with the particular perspective of someone who had always been adjacent to the celebration rather than inside it. She was not unhappy. She had made her peace with this position many years ago. But she was aware of it tonight in a way she wasn't always. Aware of the line between the people who were dancing and herself standing still with a serving spoon in her hand. Clara Voss drifted past the table with her usual elegant ease, in a green dress that probably cost more than Abigail made in a month. Clara was 23 and blonde, and had the kind of beauty that operated like a gravitational force. Things moved toward her without being asked. She was also, Abigail knew from observation, not a cruel person. She was simply very used to the world arranging itself around her convenience, which produced in her a kind of benign unawareness of everyone operating in the spaces she didn't occupy. She took a piece of cornbread without looking at who handed it to her, and drifted on, trailing 2 other young women in her wake. Abigail watched her go and felt nothing in particular. This was also strategy, also practice. You keep watching the dancers. She turned. Colton Mercer was standing at the end of the table, hat still in hand. I was watching Clara Voss, she said, because it was true, and because she didn't see the point in pretending otherwise. Why? She considered this for a moment. I was trying to remember the last time I moved through a room like that, she said. Like I belonged in it. I think I've been trying to remember for quite a while. He looked at her steadily. And I can't, she said. Something moved across his face. Not pity, she was careful to check for that and didn't find it. Something else. Something that took the weight of what she'd said seriously without trying to lighten it. How long have you been standing back here today? He asked. She glanced at the table. Since 10 this morning. And have you eaten anything? She opened her mouth and closed it again. He raised an eyebrow. I've been busy, she said. Come on, he said. I can't leave the table, Mr. Mercer. Colton. He said it with the mild firmness of someone correcting a minor error. And the table will manage without you for 10 minutes. Mrs. Dawson has 3 volunteers back there, and they look to me like they're running out of things to do. She looked. This was, in fact, accurate. The supper rush had not yet begun, and the 3 auxiliary women behind the far end of the table were indeed rearranging things that didn't need rearranging, with the focused energy of people inventing work. She wiped her hands on her apron. 10 minutes, she said. He found her a plate and filled it himself. Not the sparse, apologetic portions she typically allowed herself, but an actual meal, beans, bread, a slice of roast pork, a spoonful of the sweet potato mash that someone's grandmother had contributed, and that was disappearing fast. He handed it to her with the same direct ease with which he did everything, and she accepted it because declining seemed ungracious and because she was, in fact, hungry. They stood at the edge of the grounds, away from the serving tables, but near enough to the musicians that the music reached them clearly. She ate, and he didn't fill the silence with unnecessary talking, which she appreciated more than she could easily say. Most people, when they were nervous or unsure, talked to cover the gap. He seemed comfortable with gaps. You stayed in town 3 extra days last month, she said finally. I did. Business? He was quiet for a beat. Some business, he said. Some not. She looked at him sideways. There was a fence line I needed to discuss with a man at the grain store, he said. That was the business. A pause. And I found the boarding house table more interesting than I expected. The music shifted, the fiddle moving into something slower, more deliberate. Several of the dancers adjusted their step. Mr. Mercer, she started. Colton. Colton. The name felt strange in her mouth, too familiar, too close to something she hadn't given herself permission to want. You're a thoughtful man, and I think you mean to be kind. But I've been in this town 8 years, and no man has sat at that dining table and learned my name. And then you arrive for 4 days, and... She stopped, looked at her plate. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it, he said. Not right now. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean. His voice was quiet, but absolutely level. You mean you're waiting for the part where it becomes clear I didn't mean it? She said nothing, which was, she supposed, its own kind of answer. He turned to face her more fully. Abigail, I watched you give your own supper to a child on the first night I was there. I watched you cover the back window with burlap when the cold came in, probably not the first time you'd done it. I watched you learn every person's preference at that table in 4 days and execute all of them without being asked. I watched you take up exactly as much space as you needed, and not 1 inch more, for 8 years, in a town full of people who never asked you to be anything other than convenient. He paused. I found that interesting. I find you interesting. I don't think that's complicated. The words landed somewhere in her chest and sat there heavy and warm and entirely unwelcome in the way that deeply true things can be unwelcome when you've spent years constructing your life around their absence. Her throat tightened. She made herself hold still. I'm not looking for pity, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Good, he said. I'm not offering any. I'm not... She looked at him then, really looked the way she'd looked at herself in the mirror that morning, just trying to see it plain. His expression was open and patient and held no agenda she could detect. She had a good sense for agenda. She had needed to develop one. In the orphanage, and she'd sharpened it over years of reading rooms and reading people. She read him now. What she found was uncomplicated. What she found was genuine. This, paradoxically, was the most frightening thing. The music shifted again, the fiddle rising into something bright and quick. Laughter moved through the dancers. Clara Voss spun past in her green dress, her partner red-faced and delighted. Dance with me, Colton said. The words hit her like cold water. I don't, she started. Colton, I don't dance. I haven't danced in... I'm not certain I know how to... You know how, he said. It's in your body, same as cooking is. You've just been standing still too long. People will stare, she said, and hated herself slightly for saying it, for how plainly it revealed the shape of her fear. Some of them, he agreed, without flinching. Let them. She stood at the edge of the festival grounds, plate in hand, with the music coming through the cold air and the lanterns swaying slightly in the wind, and every practical, self-protective instinct she had developed over 32 years telling her to say no, to say she was needed at the table, to say she was tired, to find any one of the dozen perfectly reasonable retreats that were available to her and take it the way she always took it. She thought about the orphanage, about visiting days and the careful, instinctive way she'd learned to make herself small, to fold herself back, to take up only the space she'd been allotted and not want for more. She thought about 8 years in this town, behind this table, feeding people who looked through her rather than at her. She thought about being hungry and giving the bread away anyway. She thought about going to bed without supper and not minding, because the alternative had been watching a child go without. She had never stopped giving. She had simply stopped expecting to receive. She set the plate down on the corner of a nearby table. If I step on your feet, she said, I will not apologize. Something opened up in his face, not just a smile, something larger and less controlled than that. Fair enough, he said, and offered his hand. She took it. They walked out onto the open ground in front of the platform, and the fiddle was playing something in 3/4 time, and Abigail was aware, in the sharpened and slightly surreal way of moments that the body knows are significant before the mind has caught up, that the people around them were noticing. She felt it in the small shifts of attention, heads turning, conversations dropping a register, eyes moving toward them and lingering. She kept her eyes on Colton. He found the beat and moved into it with the naturalness of a man who had danced before and didn't think about dancing while he was doing it. He held her correctly, not too close, his hand at her back with the light, steadying pressure of something offered rather than imposed. She found the step, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, with the muscle memory of a younger version of herself who had learned it from watching through windows and never practicing. There you are, he said quietly. She almost laughed. She didn't quite. But the thing that moved through her in that moment was close to it. Lighter than relief, warmer than gratitude, the specific feeling of something long compressed, beginning very carefully to open. She was aware of the staring. She was aware of Clara Voss, stopped at the edge of the dancing ground, watching with an expression of unguarded surprise. She was aware of the mill worker who had sat beside Colton at breakfast on his first morning, looking over from the fence with his mouth slightly open. She was aware of all of it, and she kept dancing anyway. The song ended. They slowed to a stop. There was a moment of stillness between them before either of them moved. Again, he asked. She looked up at him. In the lantern light, his face was warm and clear, and asking nothing of her except the answer to a simple question. Around them, the crowd had begun to resume its various conversations, its various movements. The festival reasserting itself over the brief interruption of their particular moment. But it had happened. She had been seen, not from behind a serving table, not from behind a kitchen door, but out in the open, in the light, by someone who had come looking for her specifically. It was a small thing, perhaps. In the accounting of the world, it was only a dance. But for Abigail Reed, who had spent 32 years learning to want nothing, it was the most terrifying and extraordinary thing that had happened to her in as long as she could remember. "Yes," she said. "Again." The fiddle lifted into the next song, and they moved with it, and the lanterns swung in the cold autumn wind, and no one looked away. The invitation came on a Tuesday, delivered not by letter, but by Colton himself, who rode into Hallow Creek with a wagon bed full of empty supply crates and a question he had apparently been turning over for some time before he asked it. Abigail was in the back garden of the boarding house, beating dust from a rug she'd hung over the fence line when she heard the horse. She didn't look up immediately. Horses came and went on that road all day. She brought the flat paddle down against the rug twice more before she registered that the sound had stopped directly on the other side of the fence. "Morning," said Colton. She lowered the paddle. He was sitting easy in the wagon seat, reins loose in his hands, looking at her the way he had looked at her every time she'd seen him since the festival, directly, without apology, without the slight awkwardness she might have expected from a man who had asked a woman to dance in front of half the town, and was now perhaps uncertain how that had landed. He did not seem uncertain about very much. "Morning?" she said. She was aware that she had dust on her forearms and probably on her face as well. She did not reach up to check. He climbed down from the wagon and came to lean against the fence, and she waited, because she had learned that Colton Mercer generally came to a point without requiring assistance. "I've been thinking," he said, "about... The ranch needs a cook." She looked at him steadily. "You've managed without one." "Badly," he said. 3 ranch hands, 2 of whom are eating whatever the third one makes, and the third one made something last week that I am still trying to identify. It cost me 2 days of productivity because everyone was sick." Despite herself, she almost smiled. "What was it?" "He believes it was a stew. I have my doubts." She returned her attention to the rug, brought the paddle down once, methodically. "There are women in town who cook for hire." "There are," he agreed. "I've spoken to 2 of them. Mrs. Harmon wants to work 3 days a week and go home by 4. Mrs. Birch has a husband who doesn't want her out at a ranch." "And so you thought of me." "I thought of you," he said, "before I spoke to either of them." She stopped paddling, turned to look at him. He met her eyes without blinking. "Abigail," he said, "I'm not asking because you're the last option. I'm asking because you're the right one. There's a difference." The morning was cold and clear, and somewhere in the elm tree at the far end of the garden, a bird was conducting a one-sided argument with itself. She stood with the rug paddle in both hands and felt the weight of the question. Not just the practical question of the job, but the other thing layered beneath it. The thing neither of them was stating directly, which was that she knew and he knew, and they both knew, that this was not simply an employment arrangement being proposed. She thought about the boarding house, about the closet she slept in and the kitchen she worked in, and the 8 years she had spent becoming invisible by degrees. She thought about Mrs. Calloway's particular sideways kindness, which was real in its way, but was not, had never been, the same thing as belonging somewhere. She thought about the harvest festival, about the lanterns and the fiddle and the specific quality of Colton's hand at her back, steadying, not possessive, offering, not requiring. It would be a significant change, she said, because it was true, and because she needed to say something that was not yes and was not no. "Yes," he said simply. "I would need to give Mrs. Calloway proper notice." "Of course. And I would need my own room, not a closet." Something moved in his expression. Not amusement exactly, but something related to it. Warmer. "There are 4 bedrooms in the ranch house as that," he said. 3 of them are unoccupied." She looked at the rug. She looked at her hands on the paddle. She looked at the elm tree at the far end of the garden, where the bird had finally resolved its argument in its own favor and fallen silent. "I'll need 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, he agreed. She went back to beating the rug. After a moment, she heard him push off the fence, heard his boots cross the ground back to the wagon, heard the creak of the seat as he climbed up. "Abigail," he said. She looked over her shoulder. "Bring the apple butter recipe," he said. "The one from the festival. I've been thinking about it since October." She turned back to the rug. "I'll consider it," she said. He laughed, that same uncomplicated laugh she'd heard through the boarding house wall on the first night. And she heard the wagon begin to move, and she stood in the back garden in the November cold and let herself feel, very briefly and very carefully, something that might have been hope. It was a fragile thing. She handled it accordingly. The 2 weeks passed in a state of quiet, organized dismantling. There was not much to dismantle, which was itself a kind of information about the shape of the life she was leaving. The boarding house closet held a cot, a chest of drawers, her clothes, her small shelf of practical books, a cooking reference she'd saved up for, a dog-eared almanac, a slim volume of American poetry she'd found discarded in the alley behind the Mercantile and kept because the words in it made her feel slightly less alone on difficult nights. She packed these things into the same bag she had carried away from Hartwell House at 16, which was now softer at the corners and darker from years of use, but otherwise unchanged. She trained the girl Mrs. Calloway had hired to replace her, 17 years old, eager, with the kind of natural instinct for cooking that could be developed into something real if someone took the time to show her the right foundations. Abigail took the time. She showed the girl how to read a stove, how to tell when oil was at the right temperature without a thermometer, how to make the boarding house cornbread that had become, over 8 years, the thing people mentioned when they mentioned the boarding house at all. "The buttermilk," the girl said, watching her. "You said that before." "The buttermilk," Abigail confirmed, "and you brown the butter first. Don't rush the browning. That's where the flavour lives." On her last evening, Mrs. Calloway found her in the kitchen after the supper service, finishing the final clean-up with the same thoroughness she brought to everything she did. The older woman stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking, in the way she sometimes stood when she had something to say that she was still deciding how to say. "He's a good man," she said finally. "Colton Mercer. His father was decent. Not always an easy man, but decent. The son takes after him in the good ways." Abigail wrung out the cloth and hung it on the rack. "I'm going as the cook," she said. "Of course," said Mrs. Calloway, in a tone that suggested she understood considerably more than the words being exchanged. There was a brief pause. "You should have been seen sooner," Mrs. Calloway said quietly and with the directness of someone who has weighed a statement carefully before delivering it. "That is not entirely not my fault." Abigail looked at her. In 8 years the woman had not said anything like this, and Abigail knew better than to make too much of it. She was not a woman given to false sentiment in either direction. But she also knew it had cost something to say, and she received it accordingly. "You gave me a place," Abigail said. "I'm grateful for that." "It wasn't enough," said Mrs. Calloway. She turned and went back down the hall, and that was all. It was, from Eliza Calloway, the closest thing to an apology she was constitutionally capable of producing, and Abigail understood it perfectly. She finished the kitchen, she blew out the lamp, she picked up her bag and walked out of the boarding house without looking back, because looking back was a habit she had deliberately never cultivated. The wagon was waiting in the early morning dark. She put her bag in the back and climbed up to the seat without assistance, which made Colton say nothing at all, which was, she was coming to understand, his particular way of respecting a thing. They drove east in the cold grey light before sunrise, and neither of them talked much, and the silence between them was comfortable in the specific way that silence is only comfortable between people who have already established that they are not strangers. The Mercer Ranch announced itself gradually. First a fence line running parallel to the road, then a water tower visible above the tree line, then the buildings themselves coming into view as the wagon rounded the long curve that opened onto the main yard. It was not a grand spread. Abigail had not expected grand. What she had not expected was the way the land lay around it, wide and open and quietly beautiful in the winter light, the brown grass running out to a distant tree line of bare cottonwood and elm, the sky above it enormous and pale blue, and entirely indifferent to human concerns in the particular way of Kansas sky. The ranch house itself was 2 stories, solidly built, the kind of construction that spoke of a man who had put materials into the bones of something and expected it to last. There was a wraparound porch with 2 chairs on it, a kitchen garden spent for the season but laid out with care, the beds defined by careful wooden edging, a barn, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings, smoke coming from the bunkhouse chimney. 3 men came out of the barn as the wagon pulled in. Abigail assessed them without appearing to, an old habit, useful in any new situation. The eldest was perhaps 50, weathered and solid, with the kind of face that had decided on its expression some years ago, and was disinclined to change it. The second was young, barely 20, with reddish hair and the open countenance of someone who had not yet learned to conceal what he was thinking. The third was between them in age, broad across the shoulders, with a dark beard and watchful eyes that moved from Colton to her and back with a professional neutrality that she recognized as the particular neutrality of someone forming a first impression they haven't decided about yet. "Walt, Tom, Eddie," Colton said, climbing down from the wagon. "This is Abigail Reed. She'll be cooking for us starting today." Walt, the eldest, gave her a nod that was neither warm nor unwelcoming, purely a transaction of acknowledgement. Tom, the red-headed one, immediately said, "Can you make biscuits? Eddie's biscuits are like eating packed dirt," which earned him a flat look from Eddie and a sound from Colton that might have been a suppressed laugh. "I can make biscuits," Abigail said. "Good enough for me," said Tom. She picked up her bag from the wagon bed before anyone could offer to carry it and followed Colton into the ranch house. The kitchen was large and functional and had not been cleaned thoroughly in some months. This did not bother her. She stood in the center of it and turned slowly, taking inventory. The stove, which was a good one, the iron well seasoned, the work table, solid oak, more than enough space, the shelves only partially stocked, with gaps that told her what had been used and not replaced. A north-facing window over the sink that would get no afternoon sun. A door directly to the back porch. "It needs work," Colton said. He was watching her from the doorway. "It needs cleaning and a proper stock of supplies," she said. "Give me 3 days." He nodded. "The room is upstairs, first door on the left. It has a window that faces east." She looked at him. "I thought you might like the morning light," he said simply. She carried her bag upstairs. The room was not large, but it was real. A real room with a real bed, with a quilt on it that had been made by someone's careful hands, the stitching uniform and tight. A washstand with a proper mirror. A chair by the window. The window itself faced east exactly as he'd said, and even in the flat November light she could see what it would be in summer. The long morning light coming in gold and clear, and entirely, unambiguously hers. She set her bag on the chair. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her hands in her lap and was still for a moment. She had slept in a closet for 8 years. She had slept in a dormitory for 16 years before that. She had never, in her adult life, had a room with an east-facing window and a chair and a quilt made by someone who cared about the quality of their stitching. She did not cry. She was not a crier. But she sat on the edge of that bed for 2 full minutes and felt the weight of the thing settle into her, and when she stood up and went back downstairs to begin the work of making a kitchen her own, she moved differently than she had when she'd climbed those stairs. Something had shifted in her bearing. Something small and structural, the way a small shift in foundation changes everything built above it. She learned the ranch the way she learned everything, by doing, by watching, by asking the right questions and listening carefully to the answers. She learned that Walt had a bad knee that worsened in cold weather and made him slower on the stairs than he wanted anyone to notice. She learned that Tom ate prodigious quantities of food and never seemed to change in size, a fact that impressed her professionally even as it complicated her supply calculations. She learned that Eddie, the bearded one with the watchful eyes, was a more complex person than his first impression suggested, quiet and efficient at his work, unexpectedly well-read, holding himself at a slight remove from everyone except the horses, with whom he had a relationship of what appeared to be mutual respect. She learned that Colton woke before everyone, that he was usually in the barn by 5, and that he came in for breakfast exactly at 7 with the precise punctuality of a man who believed that consistency was a form of respect for the people who had prepared the meal. She learned that he drank his coffee black and ate whatever was put in front of him without complaint, and that when something was good, particularly good, he said so simply and without performance, in the same tone he used for everything. "This is excellent," he said on the 3rd morning of the biscuits she'd made. Not excessive, just true. Across the table, Tom looked up from his plate with an expression of vindicated joy. Walt said nothing, but he had a 3rd biscuit, which Abigail noted. Eddie glanced at her from his end of the table. His watchful eyes held something that might, in a different face, have been a smile. "How long were you at the boarding house, Shadis?" he asked. It was the first direct question he'd put to her. 8 years, she said. He nodded slowly. Their loss. She picked up the coffee pot and refilled cups and said nothing, but she carried his words with her through the rest of the morning. The weeks that followed had a rhythm she had not anticipated. At the boarding house, the rhythm had been relentless and isolated. She worked alone, in service to people who passed through, who left, and were replaced by others who knew nothing of her and expected everything of her. Here the rhythm was different. The same people came to the table every morning and every evening. She learned their individual complaints and preferences and personal histories in the natural way that comes from proximity and repetition. Tom told her about the family he'd come from. Big, noisy, a farm in Missouri that had stopped being viable the year the river flooded and taken half the topsoil with it. Walt had been on this ranch since Colton's father built it, and carried a loyalty to the land that was less sentiment than bone-deep habit, the way a person carries a language they learned before they could remember learning it. Eddie, it emerged over time, had come from somewhere back east, somewhere with libraries and universities, and a father who had expected him to become something in particular, and from which he had departed at 22 without explanation and had not returned. He did not elaborate on this, and she did not press. She simply noted it and filed it in the particular part of her mind she reserved for things that explained other things. She worked hard. This was not new, but the quality of the work was different. It had weight and direction and consequence, in a way that the boarding house work, for all its necessity, had not. When she made a meal here, she saw it eaten by people she knew, and saw how it affected them, how it gathered them, how it settled the small frictions of a long day, how a good supper could shift the temperature of an entire evening. She had always known this about food, intellectually. Here she felt it. There was the evening in late November, when Walt's knee gave out badly on the icy path between the barn and the bunkhouse, and he came in moving stiffly and not saying anything about it, and Abigail had already had the cast iron heating with the specific intention of making something warming, and put a bowl of potato soup in front of him before he'd gotten his coat off. He looked at the soup. He looked at her. He said, "How did you—" And she said, "Sit down, Walt," and he sat down. He thanked her for the soup that night and for nothing else, which was entirely consistent with his character, and she respected it. There was the afternoon she found Tom in the barn with a sick calf, a young one, barely a week old, that had come into the world in the wrong presentation and had been struggling since. Tom was sitting in the straw with it across his knees, his expression helpless and a little miserable, because Tom was 20 and had not yet developed the defenses that came later, the ones that let you watch an animal fail without feeling it. Abigail crouched at the straw beside him and assessed the calf with the practical eye of someone who had spent months on a ranch and paid attention. She had been up the night before, not unusual for her, and she would be up again tonight. "Go get some rest," she said. "I'll take the next watch." Tom looked at her. "It's not your—" "Tom," he went. He was too tired to argue, which was the intended calculation. She sat in the barn through the rest of that afternoon, and into the evening with the calf's head in her lap, feeding it warm milk from a bottle she'd prepared in the kitchen, checking its temperature, talking to it in a low, continuous murmur that was less communication than simply the sound of presence. The kind of sound that says, "I am here, you are not alone, keep going." It was what she would have wanted, she thought distantly, at the beginning of her own life. Someone simply present and steady, keeping their hand on the back of something that was trying to find its footing. She kept at it through the night. By morning, the calf had rallied. Not dramatically, not with any sudden turn, but with the gradual and determined small movements that signaled the tide had shifted. She walked back to the house in the grey early light and found Colton already up, already at the kitchen table with his coffee, already aware from some quality of the morning that something had happened. He looked at her, at the straw on her coat, the tiredness around her eyes. "It's going to be all right," she said. He let out a slow breath. "You were out there all night?" "Yes." He got up and poured her a cup of coffee and put it in front of her chair, and did not say anything more about it. She sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup, and felt the warmth come through, and thought that this, specifically, being handed something warm by someone who had noticed she was cold, without being asked and without ceremony, was one of the finest things she had experienced in recent memory. She did not say this. She drank the coffee. But when she looked up, Colton was watching her with the same expression she had first seen in the boarding house dining room, that particular steady attentiveness that quality of seeing something and intending to keep seeing it, and she thought that some things did not require words to be understood clearly. The ranch had started to change around her in small, observable ways. The table was a gathering place now rather than a refueling stop. The bunkhouse men lingered after supper where they had not lingered before. Small conflicts between Walt and Tom that had formerly escalated over the course of an evening had a tendency to dissolve somewhere between the main course and dessert, diffused by the particular alchemy of a good meal and the presence of someone who kept the peace simply by maintaining a kind of warm, unhurried steadiness. Abigail noticed all of this. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, without making a production of it, filing it carefully, understanding what it meant and what it didn't. What it meant was that she was, in some way she hadn't quite accounted for, necessary here. Not convenient, not useful in the peripheral, furniture-like way she had been useful before. Necessary in the way that certain things are necessary to the functioning of a place, the way water is necessary, the way warmth is necessary, quietly and absolutely, and without which the whole enterprise would be something lesser. What it didn't mean, or what she still held herself carefully back from deciding it meant, was the other thing. The thing she sometimes caught in Colton's expression when he didn't know she was watching. The thing that lived in small gestures. The east-facing window he'd specifically arranged. The coffee that was always ready at the hour she needed it. The way he had, twice now, ridden back to the supply store in town because there was something she'd mentioned running low on, and had returned with it before she'd gotten around to adding it to the formal list. She was not ready to name that thing yet. Or she was, and was choosing not to, because naming it would make it real in a way that required her to decide what to do about it. And the last time she had allowed herself to fully consider what it might mean for someone to choose her, not for what she could do, but for what she was, she had talked herself out of it before the thought was fully formed. Winter was coming in hard now. The nights were long and cold, and the days had that particular stark beauty of the Kansas plains in December. Everything stripped bare and clarified, the sky enormous and low, the ground frozen and still. Abigail was, for the first time in as long as she could remember, warm. Not just physically, something interior, something she had kept at a careful, protective distance from her own life behind the kitchen door and the serving table and the years of useful invisibility. She stood at the east-facing window in the early morning before the house was awake and watched the dark slowly separate itself into shapes and felt it and was careful with it and did not yet allow herself to believe it would stay. But she stopped, in those mornings, trying to talk herself out of it entirely. That was new. That was, for Abigail Reed, very nearly everything. The first hard snow of winter came on a Thursday night in December, arriving without the courtesy of a gradual build-up. No preliminary flurries, no gentle warning. 1 hour the sky was clear and bitterly cold, and the next the world outside the ranch house windows had turned white and continued turning, the snow falling in thick, wind-driven sheets that erased the fence lines and the outbuildings and everything beyond 10 feet of the porch. Abigail stood at the kitchen window and watched it come. She had seen hard winters before. The orphanage in Missouri had not been generous with heat, and she had learned early what cold meant when it meant business. But there was something different about watching a storm arrive when you were on the inside of it. When you had a stove behind you and a roof above you and 4 walls between yourself and what the sky was doing. She was aware of this distinction in a way she had not always been able to be, and she did not take it lightly. She turned back to the kitchen and began preparing for the morning. By the time Colton came in from the barn at 9, stamping snow from his boots in the back entry, she had 2 additional lanterns lit and a pot of soup on the back of the stove that would keep through the night without requiring attention. He stood in the kitchen doorway with snow still on his shoulders and looked at the room, the light, the heat, the organized readiness of it, and something in his face settled. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough," he said, "drifting against the bunkhouse door already. I told the men to stay in tonight, not to cross the yard unless the barn needs it. I'll take a pot of soup across before it gets worse." "Abigail." "I know the yard," she said. "I've walked it every day for 6 weeks. I know where the rope line is." He had strung a rope between the house and the bunkhouse in October. She had noticed it then and stored the knowledge away. "I won't be gone 10 minutes. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. This was a thing they had developed between them in 6 weeks of proximity. A particular kind of exchange, mostly silent, in which she proposed something and he assessed it and concluded that she had already thought through whatever objection he was forming. "Take my heavy coat," he said. "It's by the door." She took his heavy coat. It was enormous on her, the shoulders dropping to the middle of her upper arms, the hem reaching nearly to her knees. She wrapped it around herself and tied it and picked up the pot with both hands. 10 minutes, he said as she went out the back door. Less, she said, and was gone into the white. He was still in the kitchen when she came back 9 minutes later, which meant he had not moved from the spot, which meant he had been standing there watching the clock. She set the empty pot in the sink and took off his coat and hung it back by the door and felt his eyes on her back the whole time. "They were fine?" he asked. "Walt's knee is bothering him. I left them with enough soup for breakfast too." She turned around. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed and an expression that she was coming slowly to read. An expression that appeared to be neutral but was not neutral at all. That was in fact quite full of something he had not yet found the right moment to say. She had been watching that expression accumulate for approximately 3 weeks. She had been waiting for the moment too, in her own way, with her own particular mixture of anticipation and the deep-grained caution of a woman who had been disappointed enough times to know that hope was a thing you rationed carefully. "Sit down, Colton," she said. "Have some soup." He sat down and she ladled soup, and neither of them said the thing that was in the room with them. And this was fine because the storm was going to be here for a while, and so were they, and neither of them was going anywhere. The snow kept up for 3 days. In those 3 days, the Mercer Ranch contracted to its essential elements: the house, the bunkhouse, the barn, and the rope line connecting them. The world beyond the fence line ceased to exist in any practical sense. The men came and went between the bunkhouse and the barn in organized shifts, keeping the animals warm and the snow cleared from critical areas, and returned each time to the bunkhouse smelling of cold and horses and the particular sharp exhaustion of physical work in extreme weather. Abigail kept the kitchen running. She baked bread in the mornings and soup in the afternoons, and hearty suppers in the evenings, and the food crossed the yard in the big pot and came back empty, and she filled it again. She kept coffee on all day. She kept the kitchen warm in a way that made the whole lower floor of the house feel like a held breath, contained, protected, insulated against whatever the storm was doing outside. On the second evening of the storm, Colton came in from a late barn check and found her at the work table, cutting dried apple into a bowl for a pie she intended to make in the morning. He stood by the stove, warming his hands, and she worked, and the kitchen was full of the smell of wood smoke and bread that had been baked 6 hours ago and was still scenting the air. "Tell me something," he said. What kind of something?" "Something I don't know." He pulled a chair from the table and turned it around, sitting with his arms across the back of it. "Something about before." She kept cutting. "Before is a long category. Pick a part of it." She thought for a moment, the knife moving steadily. "When I was 11, she said, "there was a cook at the orphanage, a woman named Marjorie, who only stayed 2 years before she moved on to somewhere that paid better. She was the first person who ever told me I had talent in a kitchen." A pause. "Not as a compliment, more the way a carpenter looks at a piece of wood and says, 'This will do.' A professional assessment." "That mattered to you." "It mattered enormously," she said. "I had never been assessed for anything except my size and whether I was going to be adopted. To be assessed for something I could do." She set down the knife and considered the bowl of apples. "It was like being handed a map in the dark, like suddenly there was a direction." He was quiet for a moment. "What happened to Marjorie?" "I don't know. She left on a Thursday, didn't say goodbye, which I held against her for years before I realized that she owed me nothing. She had given me the map, and the rest was my work to do." She picked up the knife again. "I think about her sometimes, whether she ever knew what she handed me." "She didn't," Colton said. She looked up. "People almost never know," he said, what they give people by accident." She held his gaze for a beat longer than she usually allowed herself. "No," she said finally. "I suppose they don't." The fire shifted in the stove. Outside, the wind made its insistent, repetitive argument against the walls. She went back to the apples and he stayed in the chair with his arms on the back of it. And they talked through the evening in the easy, wide-ranging way of two people who have run out of small talk and moved, almost without noticing, into the territory beneath it. She learned things about him in those 3 days that the ordinary pace of ranch life had not yet given her. She learned that his father had been a complicated man to love, demanding in the way of men who have built things with their hands and cannot understand why the world does not respond with equivalent precision. She learned that Colton had spent 2 years after his father's death not grieving exactly but recalibrating, learning to live inside a life that had become entirely his own for the first time, without the counterweight of a parent's expectation against which to push. She learned that he had, in that period, been lonely in a way he had not admitted to anyone, including himself, until the admission came out naturally in the warm kitchen on the second night of the storm, without drama, simply stated. Simply, "I know something about that," she said. "I know you do," he said. The third morning the snow stopped. By noon the sky had cleared to the hard, brilliant blue that follows a storm like an apology. The men came out of the bunkhouse and began the work of digging out, their voices crossing the yard in the cold air with the particular energy of people released from confinement. Abigail stood on the back porch with her coffee and watched them and felt the specific, complex texture of the preceding 3 days settle into something she could not quite name yet. Something had changed in those 3 days. Not dramatically, not with any single declaration. Simply shifted the way a season shifts, incrementally, then all at once, until you looked at the light and realized it was entirely different from what it had been. It was Eddie who broke the surface first, and he did it in the quiet, sideways way that was entirely consistent with his character. She was in the barn on a Saturday afternoon in late December, checking on the calf that had become, over the past weeks, entirely hers, in all the ways that mattered. It followed her when she entered the barn, pressed its face into her coat, had developed the disconcerting habit of trying to eat her apron strings. She was scratching behind its ears when she heard Eddie come in from the far end. He stopped a few stalls down, did his particular thing of settling into a space without announcing himself. "He's going to ask you," Eddie said without preamble. She kept her hand on the calf's head. "Eddie?" "I'm not trying to make it complicated," he said. "I'm stating a fact because I think you should have a clear picture of it. He's been working up to it for 3 weeks, and the snow gave him a reason to hold off, but the snow's done now." She turned to look at him. He was leaning against the stall door with his arms crossed, his dark beard salted with the cold, his watchful eyes holding the mild seriousness of someone delivering information they believe is being delivered in the recipient's interest. "You've known him longer than I have," she said. 4 years. Is he... She stopped, started again. "Is he the kind of man who changes his mind?" Eddie was quiet for a moment, which with Eddie was not evasion, but genuine consideration. "He's the kind of man," he said finally, "who doesn't say things he doesn't mean. I have not known him to say something he didn't mean in 4 years. A pause. "That's rarer than you might think." She looked at the calf, which was attempting to investigate the pocket of her coat with single-minded optimism. "I know," she said quietly. Eddie nodded once, pushed off the stall door, and moved toward the far entrance. He stopped at the threshold, not quite looking back. "For what it's worth," he said, "the ranch is better with you in it. Different kind of better than just the cooking, and everyone knows it, and nobody said it, so..." He went out into the cold. She stood in the barn for a long moment with her hand on the calf's nose and a tightness in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but somewhere in the narrow, difficult territory between the two, where the things you have waited for a very long time tend to live just before they arrive. Colton asked her on a Friday evening in January. It did not happen the way she might have imagined it, not that she had allowed herself to imagine it particularly, because imagining things that might not happen was a luxury she had learned early to be careful with. But if she had imagined it, she might have expected something ceremonial, something announced. The particular staging that people applied to important moments to mark them as such. Instead it was simply this. They were sitting by the fire in the front room after supper, which had become a natural thing over the past several weeks, the end of the day finding them in the same room without requiring a specific arrangement, the way water finds its level. She was mending a tear in Walt's heavy work shirt, because Walt would never ask her to do this, and she had taken it from the bunkhouse laundry and was doing it anyway. And Colton was reviewing a ledger of winter expenses with the focused expression of a man who had found a number he didn't like and was examining it from multiple angles. The fire was good. The house was warm and quiet, the way it was quiet now in the evenings, a different quality from the quiet of the boarding house, which had been the quiet of solitude. This was the quiet of two people who were comfortable being in the same room without performing anything. Colton set down the ledger. He looked at her. "Abigail," he said. Something in her went very still. Not afraid, or not only afraid, something more complicated than that. Something that was fear and readiness and the particular awareness of a person standing at the edge of a thing they have been approaching for a long time, so that when the edge arrives, the body knows it before the mind has caught up. She kept her eyes on the mending. "I'm listening," she said. He was quiet for a moment, not uncertain. She had learned to read the difference between his silences, and this one was the silence of someone who has decided what to say and is taking a breath before saying it. "I've been thinking about what I said when I came to the boarding house," he said. "When I asked you to come here, I told you the ranch needed a cook." "You did." "That was true," he said. "It was also not the whole truth." She set down the mending in her lap. She looked at him. He met her eyes with the same directness he had brought to every moment between them. From the very first night at the boarding house table when he had learned her name like it was worth the taking of time. "I came to the boarding house for supplies," he said. "I stayed 4 days because I didn't want to leave. I asked you to come to the ranch because I wanted you here, not because of what you could do here." He paused. "Because of who you are." The fire made its small sounds. Somewhere outside in the cold, an owl said something and was answered. She felt the words land the way real things land, with weight, with specificity, with the irreversible quality of a stone dropped into still water. There was no taking it back, and she did not want to take it back. And the wanting not to was itself terrifying, because she had spent 32 years armoring herself against exactly this, against wanting something this large, this particular, this frightening in its potential to be taken away. "Colton," she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. "I know what I'm saying," he said. I've known for a while. I'm not a man who speaks before he knows." He leaned forward slightly, his arms on his knees, and his eyes did not leave her face. "I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm asking you to know it, what I feel, and to take whatever time you need to know what you feel." She looked at the fire for a long moment. "I'm afraid," she said. It cost something to say it plainly, without dressing it in something more manageable, but she had decided, somewhere in the 3 days of the storm and the long evenings that followed, that this man had earned plain truth from her. "I know," he said. "I have been overlooked for a very long time," she said. "Not cruelly, mostly. Simply overlooked. And I learned to make a life inside that, and the life was small, but it was mine, and it was safe." She looked at her hands in her lap, the shirt she had been mending. "What you're describing is not safe." "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." She looked up at him. "That is not a reassuring thing to say." "I know that too." The corner of his mouth moved. "But you're not a woman who needs false reassurance. You never have been. You know the difference between a thing that's safe and a thing that's true, and you've always chosen true, even when it cost you." She stared at him. "The cornbread," he said simply. "The first night. You gave it away." She thought of that night, the child at the back door, the small wrapped cloth going to bed with nothing. She had not thought of it as courage. She had not thought of it as anything in particular. It had simply been the only thing to do. "That was different," she said. "Was it?" She did not answer immediately. The fire shifted and settled. The owl outside had gone quiet. "I don't know what I feel," she said finally. "I know what I want to feel, but I have been wrong about what I deserve before, Colton. I have been told things that were not true. I have wanted things that did not happen, and I built a life around understanding that." She pressed her hands flat against the shirt in her lap. "I cannot simply unbuild it in one evening." "I'm not asking you to," he said. "I'm asking you to consider it. Consider that something different might be true." She looked at him for a long time. He sat with it, sat with her looking at him, with all her assessment and her caution and her careful, years-earned skepticism trained on his face. And he did not flinch or deflect or rush her toward an answer. He simply remained, present and steady and exactly what he appeared to be, which was the thing she had known about him from the very beginning, and which was the thing, she now understood, that had been quietly dismantling her defenses all along. Not his words, not his gestures, simply his steadiness, his absolute reliability of character, which she had been reading and testing and verifying for months without consciously framing it as such. She looked at the man across the fire from her and saw, plainly and without further evasion, that she trusted him, not with the fragile, provisional trust she extended carefully and withdrew at the first sign of risk, real trust. The kind built from evidence, from observation, from the accumulated weight of 100 small moments in which he had been exactly who he said he was. The fear did not go away. She did not expect it to, but alongside the fear, for the first time, was something large and clear and unambiguous. "I need to say something," she said. "Say it." "I have never been chosen," she said, "in my life. I have been kept, and I have been employed, and I have been useful, and I have been tolerated. I was never adopted. I have never been the person someone wanted specifically, not for who I was, but for what I could do." She paused. "So if you are saying to me that I am—" "You are," he said, without hesitation, without caveat, clean and certain as a fact stated once and expected to stand on its own. Her throat tightened. She held herself very still, in the way she held herself when something moved through her that she intended to feel fully without losing control of. "I need a little more time," she said. "Take it," he said. "But I want you to know—" She stopped, started again. "I want you to know that I am not saying no." He nodded once, slowly. "And I want you to know," she continued, and her voice was very quiet but entirely level, "that the thing you said, about being chosen—" She looked at him directly. "No one has ever said that to me, not once, and I will not forget that you did." He said nothing, but something in his face, some final layer of careful restraint, came quietly and entirely undone, and what was underneath it was so genuine and undefended that she had to look away, back at the fire, because looking at it directly felt like looking into something too bright. They sat in silence for a while after that. She picked up the mending again. He opened the ledger again. The fire burned lower, and she got up without a word and added another log, and he watched her do it, and she sat back down. And the evening finished the way the evenings finish now, naturally, without ceremony, in the comfortable and specific quiet of two people who were no longer pretending that they were simply employer and cook sitting at the end of a working day. Before she went upstairs, she paused at the door to the hall. "Colton?" He looked up from the ledger. "The east-facing window," she said. "You arranged that before I arrived." "I did," he said. "You said you thought I might like the morning light." "Yes?" She looked at him for a moment. "You were choosing me," she said slowly, "before I even got here." He held her gaze without apology. "Yes," he said simply. "I was." She turned and went upstairs. She stood at the east-facing window in the dark and looked out at the frozen yard, the stars brilliant and cold above the bare cottonwoods, the snow lying still and white over everything. And she put her hand flat against the cold glass and felt the cold come through and underneath it behind her. The warmth of the house, her house. That was the thought that arrived, unbidden and precise. Not her employer's house, not the place where she worked, the place where she was. She stood at the window for a long time. When she finally moved to the washstand and began preparing for bed, her hands were entirely steady. The fear was still there. She was not a woman who traded in false certainties, but it had shifted into a different configuration, the way fear does when it is no longer the largest thing in the room. The largest thing in the room, she understood, was the decision she had already made without quite making it yet. She looked at herself in the mirror above the washstand, not with the old inventory, the old cataloguing of what was wrong or heavy or too plain or too easy to miss. Just looked. The woman in the mirror looked back at her, tired, strong, with the particular expression of someone who has been standing at a threshold for a long time and has finally, at last, stepped through. She blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark and felt the warmth of the house around her and listened to the still, cold night outside and thought about what it would mean to say yes. Not just to the question Colton had not yet formally asked. To all of it. To the life that was, she now understood, already built and waiting. Built around her. For her. By a man who had started building it the moment he'd arranged a room with an east-facing window for a woman he had not yet had any reason to believe would stay. She was going to say yes. She had known it for weeks, if she was honest. She had known it since the storm, maybe before. She had simply been waiting for the fear to become small enough to see past it. Lying in the dark, in the room with the east window, she finally saw past it. And what was on the other side was not frightening at all. It was the most ordinary and extraordinary thing she had ever seen. It was a life. Her life, fully, unapologetically, irreversibly hers. She closed her eyes. She slept. She told him on a Saturday morning in February, when the winter had begun its slow, reluctant retreat and the light coming through the east window had shifted by some small but unmistakable degree, arriving a few minutes earlier each day, carrying a faint warmth that the January light had not possessed. She noticed these things, the gradual adjustments of seasons, in the way she noticed most things, quietly, precisely, without making a production of the noticing. She had been awake since before dawn. Not from sleeplessness, she was sleeping better at the Mercer Ranch than she had slept in years, which was itself a kind of evidence she had been examining, but from the particular alertness that comes when a decision made privately is about to be made real by the act of saying it aloud. She had lain in the grey pre-dawn and let herself feel the weight of what she intended to do, and then she had gotten up and gone downstairs and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the sky lighten over the frozen fields. Colton came in from the barn at 7, as he always did, snow on his coat, cold air moving in behind him. He stopped when he saw her face. He was good at reading her, she had noticed, better than anyone had ever been, which was either a testament to his particular attentiveness or an indication of how little practice she had given anyone to work with. Probably both. "Sit down," she said. She poured his coffee and set it in front of the chair across from hers, and he sat down without asking why, without any of the various preliminaries that most people required before they could simply be present in a moment. She sat. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said. He waited. "I've been afraid my whole life," she said, "of wanting something that could be taken away, because the things I wanted when I was young, a family, a place to belong, someone who would look at me and decide to stay, those things were taken away before I could properly have them, by circumstances, by a world that sorted children according to what it found valuable and found me lacking." She kept her eyes on her cup. "And I learned to want smaller things, manageable things, things I could provide for myself so that no one else's decision determined whether I had them." Colton said nothing. The kitchen was warm and full of the smell of coffee and the faint ghost of last night's supper. "But I have been thinking," she said, "about the difference between safety and smallness, and I've been thinking that I have been confusing them for a very long time." She looked up at him. "I made myself small and called it safe, and the truth is that it was neither." He was watching her with his full and steady attention. "I don't know how to be chosen," she said plainly. "I don't have the practice. I will almost certainly be awkward about it, and I will sometimes wait for the part where it turns out not to be true. And I will need you to be patient with that, because it is not distrust of you specifically, but a habit of self-protection that I have been building for 32 years, and it will not simply dismantle because I have decided that I want it to." "I know that," he said. "I'm not finished," she said. He closed his mouth. "I'm also going to say," she continued, and her voice was quieter now, but absolutely steady, "that in 6 weeks on this ranch, I have felt more like myself than in any prior period of my adult life that I can identify, and that you are the reason for part of that, and the rest is the east window and the space to do work that matters, and the fact that Walt had a third biscuit the first morning I cooked them, which I am taking as the highest available endorsement." She paused. "And that I trust you, which I do not say easily and have not said to many people and mean entirely." Colton was quiet for a moment. "Is that a yes?" he asked. Despite everything, despite the seriousness of the morning, the weight of what she'd said, something moved through her that was entirely unguarded. She felt it in her face before she could compose it into anything more dignified. "That is a yes," she said. He reached across this table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, not as a gesture towards something larger, simply his hand over hers, warm from the coffee cup, present and real and entirely deliberate. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Outside, the February light was strengthening over the fields, and somewhere in the bare cottonwoods at the far end of the yard, A bird that had no business being here this early in the season was singing anyway, unreasonable and insistent and entirely sure of itself. She left her hand where it was. They were married in April when the mud had dried and the first green was showing along the fence lines, and the Kansas sky had returned to the enormous, generous blue of spring that made the whole prairie feel like the beginning of something rather than the continuation of it. The wedding was not large, and then it became large because Hallow Creek turned out in the way that small frontier towns turn out for events. Not by invitation exactly, but by the collective decision of people who have lived in proximity long enough to feel that what happens to one of them happens, in some partial and important way, to all of them. Abigail had not expected this. She had anticipated something small. The necessary legal formalities, perhaps the people from the ranch, Mrs. Calloway, if she chose to come. She had not anticipated that when she walked out the front door of the ranch house in the blue dress, the one with the bone buttons, altered now to fit her properly, by the town seamstress who had spent an entire afternoon getting the shoulders right and refused to accept payment for it, she would find a gathering on the grass in front of the porch. Mrs. Dawson from the Harvest Festival Auxiliary was there, with 3 women from her committee. The mill worker who had sat beside Colton at breakfast on his first morning was there, in a suit that had been pressed within an inch of its life. Tom had polished his boots so thoroughly that they reflected the sky. Walt was standing very straight in a way that Abigail suspected was the maximum expression of sentiment he was capable of, and understood accordingly. Eddie stood slightly to the side, which was entirely consistent with his character. But he had put on a clean shirt and combed his beard, and when she came out the front door, his eyes moved to her face and stayed there with the open, direct approval of someone who had told her months ago in a barn that the ranch was better with her in it and had not revised his opinion. And in the back, to her genuine surprise, standing with a group of women she did not know as well, her green dress exchanged for something simpler and blue, was Clara Voss. She was watching with an expression that held nothing of the unawareness Abigail had attributed to her in the early days, nothing of the benign blindness of someone accustomed to being the center of every gathering. She was watching with something more careful and more honest than that. She was watching, Abigail understood, with the particular attention of a young woman who is seeing something she had not known existed and is rearranging her understanding of the world accordingly. Their eyes met briefly. Clara gave a small, deliberate nod. Abigail returned it. Colton was waiting at the end of the path between the porch and the field, in the good coat he wore to town. He looked at her when she came out the door, and his expression was the same one she had first seen in the boarding house dining room, on the night he'd taken a bite of cornbread and said, "That is the best thing I've eaten since I left my mother's table." That genuine, undressed surprise at finding something better than expected, at finding something that was simply and entirely exactly what it appeared to be. She walked to him through the gathered people of Hallow Creek, through the April light and the spring smell of new grass, in the blue dress with the bone buttons, and she kept her chin up and her back straight, and she did not once, look at the ground. This, too, was new, or not new, recovered. The posture of a person who has decided they are allowed to take up space. The ceremony was simple. The words were the old ones, worn smooth by use, and they said them, and there was a moment after the saying of them in which the world seemed to hold very still, the way a field holds still before the wind moves through it. And then Colton looked at her with those steady, unreserved eyes, and she looked back at him with all the fear and all the trust and all the careful, painstaking, 32 years in the making willingness she possessed. And the moment released and the crowd made the sounds crowds make, and Tom cheered with an enthusiasm that startled the horses, and Walt made a sound that was approximately 1/3 of a laugh, and Eddie, in the back, smiled in the complete and unguarded way she had only seen from him once before. And Mrs. Calloway, who had come after all, who was standing at the far edge of the gathering in her good wool coat, with her hands folded in front of her, and an expression of carefully maintained composure that contained, if you knew how to read Eliza Calloway, and Abigail had had 8 years of practice, an enormous and entirely sincere satisfaction. Mrs. Calloway caught her eye and gave her a single, brief, definitive nod. Abigail nodded back. Then Colton offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked back through the gathered people toward the house, toward the table that had been set up in the yard with everything she had spent the last week preparing, and the afternoon began. The years that followed moved with the particular quality of a life fully inhabited. Not always easy, not always what was expected, but consistent in its essential nature, in the way that a river is consistent even as it changes season to season. The ranch grew. The first year brought a third field. The second year brought 2 additional hands and a new barn built to replace the old one, which had developed structural opinions that differed from the men who relied on it. The third year brought the best cattle prices the region had seen in a decade, and a kitchen garden that Abigail had expanded twice, and which produced through summer and into fall with the reliable abundance of something tended with both skill and genuine care. She was not simply the cook. She had never been simply the cook, but it took the ranch and the people on it varying amounts of time to find the right language for what she actually was. Walt arrived at it first, in the blunt and economical way that was his characteristic mode of expression. He said it once to a new hand who had asked who ran the house, and what he said was, "Abigail runs the house, Colton runs the ranch, they're the same thing," and that was the last time the question was asked. She delivered both of their children herself, with the help of the doctor from Hallow Creek, a daughter first, in the spring of the second year, with Colton's dark hair and eyes that were her own, that particular shade between brown and amber that she had never thought of as distinctive until she saw it in a child's face and understood that it was. And a son 2 years after that, who arrived with opinions he had apparently formed in the womb, and showed no sign of revising, who was loud and strong and certain of his welcome in a way that made her understand, with a force that took her breath for a moment, what it might have meant to enter the world that way, to arrive already knowing you were wanted. She named the girl Marjorie, for the cook at Hartwell House, the woman who had handed her a map in the dark. When she told Colton, he had looked at her for a long moment and then said quietly, "She'll know who she's named for." "Yes," said Abigail, "I'm going to make sure of that." The children grew up knowing the ranch in the way children know places that are deeply, genuinely theirs, with the absolute unself-consciousness of people who have never needed to wonder whether they belonged. They learned to ride and to plant and to read weather and to work alongside the ranch hands with the easy companionship of people raised to understand that dignity came from what you did with your hands, not from what category the world put you in. Abigail taught them to cook before she taught them anything else that could be taught in a kitchen, because she understood that knowing how to feed people was knowing how to take care of them, and that was the foundation of everything. She was not a permissive mother. She was a fair one, which was better, and a present one, which was better still. She did not indulge self-pity in herself or in anyone around her. She did not pretend that difficulty was not difficult, or that loss was not loss, or that the world was a kinder place than it was. But she also did not allow the genuine difficulties of the world to be used as reasons for meanness or smallness of spirit. And this was a lesson she delivered not by lecture but by example, in the reliable, daily way that the most important lessons are always delivered. It was Tom who started bringing people to her, though he would not have described it that way. He had married a woman from a neighboring farm, practical, bright, deeply loved, who had a younger sister struggling through the first difficult winter of her own frontier marriage, uncertain and homesick and convinced, in the way that young women sometimes became convinced when they found themselves isolated from everything familiar, that something was fundamentally wrong with her that accounted for the difficulty of her circumstances. Tom brought the sister to Sunday dinner without explaining why, in the transparent way of a man who believes he is being subtle, and Abigail understood immediately and said nothing that would compromise the fiction. She simply made the dinner very good and talked to the young woman with the particular combination of warmth and directness that was her characteristic register, and did not offer false comfort but offered true companionship, which is an entirely different and considerably more useful thing. The young woman came back the following Sunday on her own. After that, it became a pattern, not by design, but by the natural gravitational pull of a home that was genuinely welcoming to people who needed welcoming. Young women who were struggling came to Sunday dinners and found in Abigail neither a model of impossible perfection nor a catalogue of cheerful platitudes, but a woman who had been afraid and been overlooked and had built something real from the materials of her actual life, and who would speak plainly about all of it if you sat down at her table and asked. She did not present herself as exceptional. She found the idea faintly absurd, and said so once when a young woman named Helen, 17, recently arrived in Hallow Creek, visibly overwhelmed by the scale of the life she'd agreed to, suggested, with wide and slightly desperate eyes, that Abigail must have always known she would find her place. "I cleaned a flue by myself because the handyman didn't come," Abigail said. "I slept in a closet for 8 years and thought it was the best I could do. I gave away my supper and went to bed hungry more nights than I can tell you." She refilled Helen's coffee cup. "I didn't always know anything. I simply kept going and tried to be the kind of person I would have wanted to meet back when I needed one." Helen had looked at her for a long moment. "Did you find one?" she asked. "The kind of person you would have wanted to meet?" Abigail had been quiet for a moment, thinking of a woman named Marjorie who had looked at an 11-year-old girl and handed her a direction. Thinking of a man who had eaten a piece of cornbread and learned her name. "Eventually," she said. "Later than I would have liked, but yes." The orphans were Colton's idea, though he presented it as a question the way he presented most ideas that were actually decisions he'd already made on her behalf, because he had learned, over the years, that giving her the space to arrive at something herself mattered to her more than the efficiency of having it handed to her. "I was thinking," he said one evening in the autumn of their 9th year, "about whether the back room could be added onto." She looked up from the account book she was reviewing. She had taken over the household accounts in the 2nd year and had never given them back, having discovered a facility with figures that surprised her and that Colton regarded with a satisfaction bordering on smugness. "Why?" "Space," he said. "We have space." "For more." He paused. "There's a child at the Hallow Creek schoolhouse, boy, about 8. His parents, the Hartley family, the ones out on the East Road, they're gone. Fever last month, no relatives in the territory." She closed the account book. She looked at him. "I thought," he said carefully and without pressure, "that we might talk about it." She thought about Hartwell House, about visiting days and the careful, instinctive folding of herself into smallness, about the particular quality of waiting, not for any specific outcome, but simply for someone to decide that you were worth choosing. "We don't need to add on to the back room," she said. Colton waited. "The front bedroom on the 2nd floor is bigger," she said. "It gets afternoon light." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression that, after 9 years, still occasionally caught her off guard, that open, unreserved thing that had no name except that it was the opposite of overlooked. "I'll ride to the schoolhouse Monday," he said. "I'll come with you," she said. The boy's name was Daniel. He was small for his age and quiet in the particular way of children who have learned that quietness is a form of safety, and he arrived at the Mercer Ranch on a Wednesday in October with a single bag and eyes that moved around the kitchen with the rapid, assessing intelligence of someone trying to understand what was expected of them before something went wrong. Abigail recognized every part of this. She recognized it so completely that it was almost like looking into a window she had not known still existed in her. She did not overwhelm him. She did not make large declarations or offer false assurances. She showed him his room, the front bedroom with the afternoon light, which was larger and warmer than anything he had likely had access to in recent memory, and she told him dinner was at 6, and that he didn't have to do anything today except rest. He stood in the doorway of the room and looked at the bed and the window and the small bookshelf she had put in the corner with 3 books on it, not chosen at random, chosen specifically, a book of adventure stories that Tom's wife had recommended, and 2 others she had selected herself. "Is this mine?" he asked. Not meaning the room, she understood, meaning all of it, meaning the question underneath the question, the one she had spent 32 years asking in one form or another. "Yes," she said, simply and completely. "This is yours." He did not cry. He was 8 years old and had been through enough that he had, like her, learned to hold himself carefully in unfamiliar situations. But something shifted in his face, something small and structural, the way the thing had shifted in her face the day she'd gone upstairs to the east-facing room and sat on the edge of the bed. He went in and sat on the chair by the window, and she left him there and went downstairs to make dinner, and she stood at the stove with her back to the room and took one steady breath. Behind her, through the ceiling, she could feel the particular weight and presence of someone discovering, for the first time, that they were where they were supposed to be. She started the cornbread. Nearly 20 years after that first night at the boarding house on an October evening that smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke, Abigail Mercer sat on the wraparound porch with her husband while the sounds of the house moved around them through the open windows. Marjorie at the table with homework, arguing amicably with her brother about something that involved considerable passion on both sides. Daniel, 17 now, and taller than anyone had anticipated, coming in through the back door from the barn with Walt, who was 70 and still working, slower than before but present in the way that certain people are present, as if they have simply decided that leaving is not a compelling enough option. The fields beyond the fence line had gone gold with autumn. The sky was the deep, clear blue of October evenings, not the enormous pale blue of summer, but something more considered, more intimate, as if the sky had pulled itself slightly closer to the earth. Colton had his arm along the back of the porch bench, not touching her, but close enough that the warmth of it was there. This was another thing she had learned about him over 19 years, that he was a man who understood the value of proximity without pressure, who knew that presence was its own language and didn't always require augmenting. She had been turning something over all evening. She had been turning it over, in truth, for longer than that, for years perhaps, carrying it in the way she carried most things that were not ready to be said yet, in the quiet interior where she sorted and considered and waited until the words found their shape. "I want to tell you something," she said. He shifted slightly to look at her. In the fading light, his face was familiar, in the specific way that people's faces become familiar, when you have known them through seasons and through difficulty and through the ordinary, irreplaceable accumulation of daily life. Not just familiar, but necessary, in the way that certain things become so woven into what is true that their absence would constitute a different kind of world entirely. "The cornbread," she said. "The first night. The piece you said was the best thing you'd eaten since your mother's table." "I remember it," he said. "It was meant to be my supper," she said. "I had been working since 4 in the morning and I hadn't eaten since before dawn, and that piece was the one I had set aside for myself." She looked at her hands in her lap. "When I gave it to the child at the back door, I went to bed that night without eating anything." He was very still beside her. "I never told you that," she said. "You saw me give it away, and you said in the chicken yard that I gave away my own supper. And I told you it was just cornbread, but I didn't tell you that I was hungry when I went to bed, or that I had been hungry many nights before that, or that I had simply stopped noticing the hunger, the way you stop noticing a sound that's always there." She paused. "I don't know why I'm telling you now." "Because you can," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Because it doesn't cost what it used to cost," he said, "to tell me a true thing." She thought about this. He was right, which he more often than not was, in the quiet and unassuming way that tended to arrive after the fact and without fanfare. "That night," she said, "after I gave away the cornbread and went to bed, I lay in that closet and I thought about the fact that I had just made the best piece of cornbread I had ever made, and I hadn't eaten a single bite." She almost smiled. "I was very put out about it." He laughed. The same uncomplicated laugh she had heard through the boarding house wall on the very first night. The laugh that had made her tell herself to stop listening. The laugh she had been listening to for 19 years without telling herself to stop. "I should have fed you better from the start," he said. "You fed me from the second morning," she said. "You asked if I had eaten. I lied and said I had." "I know you lied," he said. "That's why I asked." She looked at him. "You knew? You had been in that kitchen since before anyone was awake, and you hadn't sat down once," he said. "I've spent my life around working people. I know what someone looks like when they've forgotten to eat." He paused. "It made me angry, not at you, at the circumstances that had made forgetting feel normal." She sat with this for a moment. "That piece of cornbread," she said, "led to you and to this house and to those children in there fighting about whatever they're fighting about. And to Walt, who is going to outlive us all out of pure stubbornness, and to Daniel, and to everything that I—" She stopped, looked out at the golden fields. "I gave away my supper and went to bed hungry, and it led to every good thing I have ever had." The evening was settling into dusk around them. The voices from inside the house had shifted into the comfortable low gear of the end of the day. Somewhere across the fields a coyote said something to the approaching dark, and the dark did not answer but accepted the statement. Colton took her hand, not the careful, deliberate gesture of the early days, the hand placed over hers across a breakfast table, the easy, automatic reach of 19 years of choosing. The gesture of a man for whom this particular hand was simply the one he reached for. The way you reach for the familiar thing in the dark without needing to look. She turned her hand over and held his. "The cornbread was exceptional, by the way," he said, "in case I haven't said it recently." She made a sound that she would not, under examination, have admitted was a laugh. "You've said it approximately 400 times. It deserves saying." The porch held them in the gathering dark, and inside the house their life continued its steady, warm, improbable motion, the life of the woman who had gone to bed hungry and woken up eventually into more than she had ever known how to want. The woman the town had overlooked, the woman the orphanage had not been able to place, the woman who had spent 8 years in a closet becoming invisible and had finally, impossibly, become the most visible and essential thing in a place she could call, without apology or qualification, her own. She had not been rescued. She had not been transformed into something she wasn't. She had simply, at last, been seen. And in being seen, had been given the room to become, fully and without reservation, what she had always been. The stars came out over the Kansas prairie, one, then several, then all of them, and the house behind her was warm with the sounds of living, and Abigail Mercer sat on the porch with her husband's hand in hers, and looked at the sky and felt, running through her the way a river runs, continuous, sustaining, entirely sure of its direction. Something she had no single word for. It was built of courage and cornbread and a child at a back door in the dark. It was built of every night she had stayed when staying was hard. Every morning she had gotten up and found the task in front of her and done it. Every piece of herself she had given away when the world gave very little in return. It was, she understood, the oldest kind of story. A woman who kept giving until the world, finally, gave back. And what the world gave back was this: the porch and the stars, and the warm house and the held hand, and the evening settling around her like the answer to a question she had stopped believing she was allowed to ask. She held on. She had learned, at last, that this was what the brave did. Not the fearless, the brave. The ones who were afraid and held on anyway. She held on. And the night came in gently, and the stars burned clear and cold, and the Mercer Ranch lay quiet under the enormous Kansas sky, and Abigail Reed Mercer, who had been nobody's, and then her own, and then finally someone's, in the fullest and most complete meaning of the word, was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had always been going here. She simply hadn't known it yet.